Hello, hello, hello. Blessings to you. Good afternoon or good day. We sincerely apologize. We are a few minutes late, but good day. Hello. It is Thursday, the 18th or 19th of October, and my glasses are fogging up. It's been a long day. But God bless you all. I hope you all are well. Do me a favor right now. Thank you so much for joining us for the Black Christians' response to the Israel and Hamas war. Do me a favor and let us know in the comments or in the chat where you are joining in from. If you're, I know that we are streaming from all over the world right now. We have guests from the USA, we have guests from the UK, and so we would really love to know where you're joining us from. We're streaming currently on Facebook and YouTube as well, so and please do feel free to share and let people know. So you've got Valerie, who is joining us on YouTube from the United States. God bless you, Valerie. And yes, I'm just about to introduce my guest from Virginia, USA. God bless you, all the way from Virginia. God bless you. I'm about to situate. Okay. Okay, well, I'm not going to belabor the time. I know that we're also going to have this up on the replay. And so I am going to not take too much time. I'm going to bring our guest. Sorry, I'm acting like an old man with these technical issues. So, all right, I'm going to just introduce our great guests here at the stage. All right. Okay. Great. Okay. So, first of all, hi. Good day. God bless each and every one of you. My name is Elijah Israel Chanak. The C is silent. I am the founder and CEO of Elijah Chanak International. And I have the esteemed privilege of bringing together these amazing voices from all across the world, quite literally. And so I'm going to start by just allowing each and every one of them to introduce who they are and what they do, so that I don't get anybody's names or occupations messed up. So I'm going to start with Mr. Justin Gibboney.
Well, Elijah, thanks for having me on. I'm Justin Gibboney, the president of the AND campaign, which is a Christian civic organization.
God bless you, sir. Thank you so much. Over to Bishop Wayne Malcolm.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Elijah. Thanks for inviting me along. I'm Bishop Wayne Malcolm, aka the Business Bishop, because of the work that we do with entrepreneurs, professionals.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Pastor Tyler Burns.
Grace and peace, family. My name is Tyler Burns. I am a pastor and also the president of The Witness, a Black Christian collective. Glad to be here, Elijah.
Bless you. Trenee.
Good morning, everyone. Hello, Elijah, or good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. My name is Trenee McGee. I'm a Connecticut state representative. I represent West Haven, Connecticut, District 116. But first and foremost, I'm a child of God, and I'm just excited to be here today.
Awesome. Geoffrey.
Great day, family. My name is Geoffrey Golden. I'm a gospel artist and worship leader.
Well, we, of course, are in a room filled with greatness. We have a lot of amazing voices and minds here, and it's such an honor again to have each and every one of you come. It goes without saying that we are living in unprecedented times. Of course, in 2020, we endured our first, in our lifetime at least, a pandemic. And of course, we've experienced multiple global recessions. We experienced as well the striking of Ukraine by Russia with an elongated war in Ukraine. And we've seen a lot of destabilization all across the world. And of course, being a Christian in this time is, without sounding controversial, it's challenging. It's challenging to stand and represent the faith in very volatile times. And so it's such an honor to have each and every one of you who have not just a consciousness of the faith, but also a consciousness of civic life and the role of the faith in the public square. And so the nature of this conversation today, I know not all of our guests are able to be here throughout the duration of this conversation. So I do want to give a chance for everybody to be able to contribute as we are able to. But the nature of this conversation is, of course, addressing the case study of the Israel and Hamas war as we look at the role of the faith in the public square. Right now, of course, on social media, there's a lot of conversations that are pro-Israel, and then you've got conversations that are pro-Palestine, and we can all agree that the polarization is at an all-time high. There is a for or against, as Justin Gibboney said recently in a tweet, that it's both sidesism. It's like sidesism. It's like what corner are you in, so to speak? And so we want to be able to bring a sober perspective to the conversation, so that this video, which is going to stay up as a replay, can be a resource. People are able to plug in and get sober perspectives from each and every one of you who are doing the work. You're actively engaged in different industries and in different spheres. And so we'd love to, again, pick your brains and know your thoughts. So I'm going to start with an initial question that is a bit of a spin-off, but it's literally, how does it feel as a Christian looking at the ongoing events with Israel and Hamas? Anybody can share. You can unmute your mic and give your perspective. How does it feel as a Christian, personally, just kind of digging into some of your personal feelings right now? How do you feel as a Christian looking at the events transpiring right now with Israel in Palestine and the entire war, as they call it? The official name is the Israel versus Hamas, war. Of course, it's not Israel versus Palestine, but how do you feel as a Christian looking at this? Just to kind of share some of your personal thoughts. Anyone can go. You can unmute your mic and just share.
Well, I would say, anytime we see this level of suffering, your heart has to go out to all those who are suffering, from the Israeli civilians to Palestinian civilians. We ought to be mourning with the mourning. And so as a Christian, for me, it's just a great deal of concern, hoping that we can get to a point of peace where there aren't so many deaths. But it's stunning. The level of disregard for life and all the suffering that's going on within the situation in general. I think Christians have to feel some way about that.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, if I can just piggyback off of that, to be someone who really cares about protecting and sustaining life, it's devastating. I think as a believer, a lot of times, like, because we're spirit first, our minds do sort of think about things spiritually. And so I know for me, I kind of went back to what I always knew in the Bible, and that was, that's Ishmael and Isaac. But, in the broader sense of things, as a human, it's sad, it's disheartening. Sometimes the challenge for me is to know how things oftentimes become so political, and the devastation that we see in that we feel is oftentimes just disconnected or cut off by politics. And so as I just forge ahead and put people over politics and people over party, it's devastating all the way around. Men, women, boys and girls. I think they show statistics on the news, and it was like children and women were being murdered far vastly, more than anyone else. And so it really just is, it's hurtful. It's really painful.
Yeah, I think I'm just going to echo what Justin and Trenee have said, that if there's one word for me, it's painful. It's painful to witness the suffering on both sides of the equation, the loss of lives, and all the emotional trauma that comes along with that for the survivors. And it's also painful to think that the very context for our Christianity, the context for our faith, the geographic context, in terms of the fact that, if you read our Bible, we're reading about these very historic places. And if you visit the land of Israel, you're literally reading the Bible to a degree. It's painful to think that spot that gives so much context to our faith is riddled with such grief, anger, resentment, aggression, confusion, hurt, and pain. And that makes it difficult. I think that's one of the things that makes it difficult, is that this is what has become of our historic and geographic context.
Yeah, I would echo, Elijah, everything that's been said by my esteemed colleagues. The pain, the tragedy, the human emotion. Jesus says that the two greatest commandments are love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And the second being like unto it, which is to love your neighbor as yourself. So out of love and concern for neighbor, as Jesus instructs, it's impossible for you to be a Christian and not feel deeply emotional, moved, and grieved by what we're seeing. I will say, just maybe to take it in a different direction, I felt candidly a little frustrated at how, once again, it seems as though those of us who are in the West, those of us who are American Christians, and consider ourselves specifically in our context, American Christians, have been caught flat-footed yet again on a major national issue. And I think we've slipped into reaction rather than responding. And it's led me to ask some serious questions about how we disciple. It's led me to ask some serious questions about how we train our people to be prepared to have cross-cultural dialogue, to be prepared to speak into what's happening in the world. But there's been a little bit of frustration that, and not frustration in a self-righteous way that we've been doing this well and everyone else hasn't, but a frustration in general that we are flat-footed yet again in reacting to an international crisis. And what would it take for us as believers to be prepared to respond well and thoroughly to ethical questions when they arise, rather than having to scramble to find answers in the moment?
And if I would just piggyback, in addition to everything else that's been shared, I think the word that comes to my mind is indignation, because I think that there is a way in which we ought to be angry over what it is that we see. Angry not just at the situation, but angry at the way in which even those of us in a Western context, our nations have contributed to the problem for decades, and how we have tried to present ourselves as solutionists, when in fact, if we really go beneath the surface, we've probably hurt more than we've helped. So I think there's an indignation. I think moments like this cause us to really, or ought to cause us to pause and to reflect and to ask, not just what's going on, how do we discern what's happening, but how do we discern how we got here? And then how do we discern, how do we move from this place into a space that is more healthy for these two people groups, and in fact, for the international order, because I think there's a lot to be said about the international geopolitical order that has a lot to do with this, the power games that are played. A lot of people treat, or a lot of nations or empires, which is what we're dealing with, have treated this region like a chess game. And so I think there's a lot to really dig into, and to really ask what the heart of God is for this region. and how do we become those who would help to, if not steward it, because we may not have the political power to steward it, how do we become voices who will bear witness to it?
Absolutely. Well, this is such an amazing segue into my first initial question. I am a graduate of the University of Cambridge. I studied human, social, and political sciences. My major was in politics and international relations, and my minor was in sociology. And so the topic of international conflict and war was pretty much enmeshed in me, in every single way in my studies. And one of the things that I looked at in the topic of politics and religion was the reading or the writing of a man called Covenor, which he asked a question of, does religion cause violence? In his writing, he specifies that oftentimes violence from the West is seen as political, whereas violence from the East is seen as terrorism. So there's a conflict that emerges in scholarship about how we define terrorism, because if we're defining it simply by the act of the murder of a person, then we could equally say that the West are defined as terrorists. You have the likes of Charles Tilley, who also speaks about Western violence is often not categorized as terrorism. And so there's a big conversation right now about what terrorism is versus what terrorism is not. And so the question I would ask is, was the attack on Israel terrorism or retaliation in light of the long drawn out history between Israel and Palestine? I know that's a heavy question. Today's going to be filled with heavy questions.
Yeah, I would say.
Okay. Go for it.
Okay. Thank you, Bishop. I appreciate it. I would say that Hamas's attack on October 7th on Israel was pretty clearly, to me, terrorism. The way that they targeted civilians. I mean, if you look at the music festival that was going on, it was almost all civilians who were killed in that attack. To me, that's very clearly terrorism. Now, is there an element of retaliation in there? I think there's an argument for that. But I think that fits the definition pretty squarely of terrorism. And even a good number of pro-Palestinian people would say that particular attack was terrorism. The next question, which you may get to, is what kind of response does that justify? And I think that's where the major question is. But I think it's pretty clear to me, and others will weigh in, that fits a definition, a sound definition of terrorism. The bigger question, in my opinion, is what response is justified based on what happened.
Okay, thank you, Justin. Thank you for sharing my sentiments exactly, and thus saving us all a lot of time. My position is unequivocal. I see it as 100% an act of terrorism, and that I think we get into dangerous territory, dangerous philosophical territory. We start to create reasons why, or try to find a set of good reasons why, or legitimate reasons why someone would mow down people at a concert, abduct babies, elderly people, decapitate, torture, brutalize. I think it's important that we, particularly we that are coming from a Christian perspective, have a very clear sense of what good and what evil. And as Black Christians, we come from a tradition where we have protested political oppression in very peaceful ways, right? Not all of us have done that, but of the liberty that my generation inherited because there was a very clear line between what was good and what was evil. And so the question that I think is kind of the back of this question is, whether the state of Israel has acted proportionately, and in what way have they contributed to the anger, the resentment, and so on. In my view, the terrorists themselves are not driven by any of those factors at all. I don't believe that there's anger of repression or any of those things. So, I'll contribute my point to that later on. I think they're motivated by an entirely different set of motives, and I do not think they actually represent the Palestinian people at all. So that's my position.
Yeah, I just wanted to contribute something just to kind of expand this, because this is going to be a perfect foundation. I know that within this conversation, we don't have the capacity to cover all of the history of Israel and Palestine and all the history of the conflict. But I think the purpose of this conversation is to really find a place of reasoning for our faith in the middle of all of this conflict, because as we know, the church right now is tremendously polarized on this topic, especially the church of ethnic minorities, meaning Black and brown peoples. Kavanaugh says something in Does Religion Cause Violence? And he writes specifically about our violence versus their violence. And our violence being modest, unitive, and rational, versus their violence being absolutist, divisive, and irrational. I'm going to read something. And again, please don't think that this is me mobilizing support for Hamas. We are not. Let's just start right now by making clear. We stand for life. We stand for Christian ethics and values. But this is what culture is talking about right now. This is what is fueling the arguments. This is what is causing the confusion. There was a tweet that was made by the Israeli Prime Minister just the other day. Forgive me, I will pull it up on the screen, but I'm unable to pull it up on the screen. Essentially, it said, Lord, forgive me, I'm being a bad journalist right now. But essentially, it spoke about a war between the children of light versus the children of darkness, the law of their state versus the law of the jungle. And constantly, if you look within any form of scholarship or any form of foreign policy analysis or international relations analysis, whenever you see language like barbarian, barbaric, jungle, whenever you see that language being used, it's the language used promoting what you call Orientalist ideology, meaning the West versus the rest. I would encourage everybody to look at the writing of Samuel Huntington in in the 90s, actually. Samuel Huntington wrote an article called The Clash of Civilizations with a question mark in 1993. That article in itself formed the basis of the entire war on terror that we know today. And in the article, he says that the battle lines of the future will be divided along the cultural lines of civilizations. And he divides the world into several different civilizations. This is where we get the idea of the Western civilization, which is underpinned by Judeo-Christian values, Western being British and American, underpinned by Judeo-Christian values. Then he speaks about the Islamic Confucian East. So he speaks about the Eastern civilization. civilization. And he says that the actual wars of the future will be underpinned by the clash of these two civilizations. Now, this is not a lecture, so I'm not trying to unpack the deeper underpinnings of that, but then he begins to speak about the fact that the future shall be a future of Muslim wars everywhere, because Muslims are, people of blood. So I say all of that to say, in light of that being the underpinning idea that is fueling scholarship and intellectualism in the West right now, is it fair to say that there is a incomplete view of the war actions taking place, or the barbaric actions, dare I say, taking place from these groups within the Middle East? Is there a skewed view? Do we need to totally, obviously we condemn violence, but do we need to totally have no level of reasoning or analysis of what their outcries are, what their policy questions are? Should Christians totally ignore it and say these are terrorists, they are anti-Western values, anti-Judeo-Christian values, write them off, do not even try to analyze what they have issues with, do not even try to look at their books, do not even try to understand? Do we just need to completely write it off and just adopt a position that says protect the West?
I think, Elijah, and thank you for the initial question, as well as the additional data that you've contributed to this aspect of the conversation. I believe to answer the first part, yes, it was terrorism, right? But that itself is not, in my view, a profound conclusion. I think that is a reality that we acknowledge, that then opens the door to greater understanding. The issue of terrorism is very interesting, because if we think about, and again, this is no justification, as you said, we absolutely stand for life. I believe that the Christian ethic, and I know we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but before it was just war, it was pacifism. If we look at the earliest centuries of the church, Christians did not believe in war at all. They didn't believe in going to war. If their nations were going to war, it was like, that's something they do. We're not a part of that. We don't believe the ethic of Jesus is violence. We believe it's nonviolence. And then as you go through the centuries, then it kind of morphs more into just war. But anyway, I think when we talk about this notion of warfare, what is justified conflict, what is justified violence versus what's terrorism, Hamas is not a state. It is a political actor. It is a militant actor, but it is not a state. It does not have the resources of a state. Even the Palestinian people have not yet fully come into a place of statehood where they have the full resources, opportunities to thrive as a state would. Israel, on the other hand, is one of the strongest militaries in the region. And so if we think, we have to talk about right and wrong, but I think when we talk about Christian ethics, it goes just beyond the thought of what's right and what's wrong on the surface. And we're really trying to answer the question, what's necessary for flourishing, which recognizes that there can be right and wrong in all different kinds of places. And all of it has to be addressed. Like the prophets of old, they weren't just calling out their own nation, they were calling out other nations, right? And they were doing it all at the same time. But this is what I'm trying to say, and I'll say it as briefly as I can, is any action from a group that does not have the resources of a state against a state is going to be terrorism, because they do not have the capacity to wage war on any other level than on the civilian population. they can shoot rockets all they want. The Iron Dome is going to bring most of them down. And so the way that groups that are disempowered, I'm not defending Hamas. I believe Hamas needs to be destroyed. But the way that a disempowered group wages warfare against an empowered group is acts of terrorism, as we would call it, rioting, things like that, where that group is trying to assert whatever kind of power or control it can, because it doesn't have the power to wage war on an equal playing field. So I think we just have to keep that in mind. Again, that is not to defend Hamas, but if we're going to get to solutions, we've got to be honest about what's going on. They don't have the capacity to wage war on an equal playing field as a nation state as powerful as Israel. So they wage warfare on that lower level of terrorism, and they commit these acts against civilians because that's the only way they can make an impact militarily in the region.
Yeah, Trenee.
I just want to say, I think, when I look at some of the issues that are happening internationally, I oftentimes think of how I think of all the many different intersectionalities. I'm Black, I'm a woman, I'm a believer, I'm an artist, I'm all of these different things. But oftentimes as a legislator, and I remember watching a scene in a film where I think it was Lyndon B. Johnson, one of the presidents, looked at Dr. King and said, "You're an activist. You only think about this one thing. I have to think about all these things." And so I think the issue in our community culturally, especially as Black people and even as Black Christians, is like when we see Israel as white people. And when the idea is who is the original Jew, and when we see Israel as white people and we see Palestinians as Native Americans and Black people. Now, although some of the challenge and struggle may be congruent, in some ways, one is it's not even appropriate for the landscape of this issue or situation because this is an international issue. It's an international policy, international ideas, international challenges. And two, we would be offended if this country, which we fought for years for the KKK to be on the terrorist list, we would be offended if we referred to them as having as being backed by acts of activism or acts of eradication. No, they were terrorists. The KKK was terrorists. And so my concern is when I see our people, and this also includes Black Christians, comparing Hamas to Nat Turner. Hamas does have funds. Hamas is funded by a really, really strong, anti-Israel. And I am not like letting Israel off, because this has been a war and battle. Innocent civilians on both sides obviously have been murdered, have died, have been raped, all of these different things. But just to give an example, if they did not have the resources or the strength or manpower that they have, they would not have been able to do as much destruction as they've done. And they're not doing this for the liberation of Palestinian people. And so oftentimes we as Black people, because of the oppression we face, we put ourselves in the shoes of a situation that is just eerily different and completely isolated from the issues and challenges that we are facing here in America. Let me give you an example. Qatar, some people say Qatar, contributed $150 million to Hamas in 2019, $100 million in 2020, and $360 million in 2021. So they've been building weaponry and ammunition. And in some part, we as Western civilization and even American government, we have to take, like you said earlier, responsibility for how we've contributed to their manpower. But this was terrorism. This was flat out terrorism. And it does not, the motive behind this does not stem from it's not for the protection of Palestinian people. One of my friends just came back from Israel, and she said that she hung out with tons of Palestinian believers. She hung out with Palestinian believers. There were Israeli Muslims. There were Black Israelis. Every sort of person, and they had the same idea and mindset. They all wanted peace towards each other. They all wanted peace towards each other. And the extremists that are teaching children when they're babies all the way up to their, adults to be suicide bombers or to hate the Palestinians or, whatever that is, just like the extremists in this country, they represent a small population of their areas. And so in reality, most of them really are on a quest for peace. And in this case, it's unfortunate, but Palestinian people are being murdered as well. I mean, Hamas's instruction to the Palestinian people was to remain in Gaza. And right now, Gaza is a very dangerous place. And so we as Black people, Black Americans, Black Christians, when it comes to international situations and climate, first of all, we obviously have to pray without ceasing. But we have to find a way to not always be the oppressed. We have to find a way to not always be the ones that sort of takes the conversation and molds it to what we feel like is our mosaic of oppression, when in actuality, like, this is a completely different situation. And when I see Black organizations with images of animated figures with on parachutes and guns, it's really disheartening, because this isn't for the liberation of Palestinian people. And not only is it not for the liberation of Palestinian people, but it's also not congruent to the issues that we faced here in America. It's a completely different situation.
Well, you just said a whole mouthful. I'm gonna let Pastor Tyler chime in. You just said a whole mouthful. I'm gonna throw. Okay, what, you want to say something first before?
No, I was just gonna say, I think the point that I hear that resonates deeply is, especially when we're approaching international waters and conflicts and things of that nature, wading into wars and things of occupation and resistance and terrorism. I think we have to have a large measure of humility, right? I do want to at least draw why certain people may feel a connection to not Hamas but Palestinian people, because there's a distinction, right? So we have Hamas being the terrorist organization, but then there's also the people of Palestine who people connect to. I do say that with what you said earlier, Elijah, it has been strikingly triggering for, I know, a lot of Black Christians to hear the state and government of Israel, not Jewish people, right? We're separating the people of Israel and also the government and the nation state of Israel, use language of savages, beast, children of darkness, which is very akin to language that we have been called on these shores. And so it's not to say that the conflicts are congruent, and it's not to say that the conflicts are the same, and it's not to say that we should wade in as if, we are in complete total solidarity with everything that's happening in the conflict itself, but that it is strikingly triggering. And I think also, if we're putting it in context to what has been prevalent issues within our domestic concerns, during the BLM, Black Lives Matter resistance and uprising, there were Palestinian people who were in contact with those who were activists, telling them how to navigate tear gas, telling them how to navigate certain things. So there's this connection based upon language and lived experience that makes it feel, even if it's not, that makes it feel like there's a greater connection between the concerns of the Palestinian people and the concerns of the people in the nation state of Israel. So I think it just in the broader context of us acknowledging, because what I've seen is typically growing up, Christians and churches would simply say, you just support Israel, you stand with Israel. And there was no history given, there was no analysis given, there was no socio-political training and understanding, there was no context. It was just, we just support Israel. And I think one of the problems that the church has is it doesn't understand language and narrative. And that doesn't resonate with Gen Z and millennials. They're not just going to believe it just because you say, specifically Gen Z, they're not just going to believe it because you say, do it. They want to know how do I reconcile dead Palestinian people? How do I reconcile a hospital bombing? And also you telling me vociferously, just stand for Israel. So I think as Black Christians, we have to wade a little bit into understanding why Gen Z feels some resonance. Now that's separate from Hamas, which I would agree is terrorists and should be destroyed and should be eliminated without questioning. But I do think there's a reason why Black Christian Gen Z and Gen Z in general has felt a little bit of connection in the reverse in this conflict.
I absolutely love this contribution that Trenee and Pastor Tyler have given, because it leads on to this really important question that I wanted to make sure we pressed in on, which is what in everyone's observations have been the main drivers of the polarization emerging as pro-Israeli versus pro-Palestinian support. So as I said in the beginning, you know, there is this kind of sense that if you are for Israel, you're against Palestine. And if you're for Palestine, you're against Israel. This is what is going on in our political climate, which is, of course, putting a conflict, and I'm sure every one of you have witnessed this, it's putting pressure upon us with our faith, because our faith is heavily influenced by Jewish culture. You know, we have the Hebrew Bible, right? We are constantly preaching about David or Esther or Yeshua. You know, we are Hebrew in culture. We are the engrafted branch, which again, that's another broadcast for another day when we're dealing with Romans 11, right? But there is a line right now that we can all discern as Black Christians of, if you're standing for one, you're against the other. What are the main drivers? And I think it's began to be opened up. I would love, and I also want to say this because I need to just plug a few things. Justin Gibboney has an amazing book called Compassion and Conviction. Am I getting it right? It's Compassion and Conviction. And that, which is the main book for his organization. And I love this because this conversation is mixed with conviction and compassion. There's a level of sensitivity to the complex realities that we're dealing with now, which is something that I don't often see. Just to give you an idea, I actually was in Israel. I was in Israel from September the 30th to October the 7th. I left Israel at 7:10. If I wasn't in Israel for 5 more minutes, I would have been stuck in the war. I know some people who were in there and they would have been, and they only got out of Israel a week after. So I would have actually been in the middle of the war or had to be on a plane with the Portuguese army and landed in a in a military base. Now, you know, I'm dramatic, so I would have been filming the whole thing. I'd be talking to everybody about the fact that I'm in a war, not just spiritual warfare, natural warfare, but literally I was there. And I'm under a lot of pressure right now. I have pro-Israel groups who absolutely do not care about Palestinians. I'll be very frank with you. There is no regard. If I mention Palestine or mention Palestinians, there's a sense of you can't agree with your enemy. And this is what it is. The Hamas covenant in 1983, I believe, writes that the end of all time, or the end of the age, will come when Israel and the Jews are completely obliterated. So the Hamas covenant actually outlines, it states, it articulates, our mission is the destruction of the Jews. This is no different from the Nazi regime. This is no different from any anti-Semitic regime that has emerged in the world. Their complete objective is the destruction of the Jews. Secondly, they were democratically elected to become the government of at least the Gaza Strip, democratically elected. So this is a collective that was democratically voted in to govern Palestinians. So because of that, there is unfortunately a mix right now between Palestine and Hamas. Though we're distinguishing the two, there's a mix of do Palestinians, is it embedded within their philosophy to hate Israel? Then, of course, with Israel, because it's funded by America, because it's funded by a lot of European nation states, there is a skepticism from Black and brown people of whether or not this is racially fueled and whether there's a sense of bifurcation. That being said, what do you think, in light of all of that information, is the main features of the polarization right now between the support of Palestine and the support of Israel? Anyone can contribute. I think
Okay, yes, please. Yes, please. If I could dive in, and can I just apologize in advance? I'm one of those that will have to leave a little earlier than scheduled, and so I'm just going to chip my 2 pence in and hang on for as much. The conversation is so rich and just great to meet you all. So I think fundamentally the church, and let's say particularly the Black majority church, is kind of caught in the crossfire of political theory, right? So let's, for argument's sake, say we have the left wing, we have the right wing of politics, right? And what that means is that a lot of our theology is politicized, okay? Because we're in this crossfire. Some of our theology is politicized, right? In that we often emphasize portions of the Bible that support a political point of view, right? And then ignore other parts that might seem to suggest support for another point of view. But not only is our theology politicized, but history itself has been politicized. So what that means is that there are multiple versions of history, all right? And if you ask one group, how exactly did, what's the origin of this problem, they're going to have one narrative. You ask another group, what's the origin of a particular narrative? I feel that the universities and institutes of higher learning lean fundamentally towards the left of that spectrum, right? And in that particular leaning, there are versions of history that I think lead to a conflation of issues. So I'm not the academic guy here, by the way, right? I'll tell you where I'm coming from in just a minute, but conflating ideas. A lot of young Black people in Britain running around saying free Palestine, free Palestine, right? If you ask them what exactly does that mean, they'll say, well, the Jews are oppressing the Palestinians, and it's about time it stops. And for reasons that I think others have articulated very well, we auto-identify with oppressed minorities because of our own history, right? So there's the sense that, okay, that's what's happening. But according to the Hamas charters, you've Elijah have well articulated, Palestine for them is the entire region, right? It is the entire region, and from their perspective, Palestine will never be free so long as a state of Israel actually exists, right? Therefore, their objective is not the creation of a two-state solution, or to create freedom for Palestinians or help for Palestinians. From my perspective, they have zero care for Palestinians, and if you look at their own history, they're not even Palestinians, right? In terms of where they've come from. So they have money, right? So I'm coming from a business point of view, right? So I'm an economist, I'm a business analyst, I'm a business consultant, and I know that missiles cost money, right? And if you have thousands and thousands of them at your disposal, then there's money. All right. We also can track the money that have been given to that group, none of which has translated to better conditions for the people. It's all translated to a military infrastructure to wage war against Israel, to fulfill what is the ultimate aim of their charter. So, but for some strange reason, everything I've just said, as though I think I can back it up with fact, it just meets this block. Right? Because it doesn't come through the mainstream. It doesn't come through mainstream media. It doesn't seem to come through the universities. It doesn't come through the colleges. It's not coming through. So it's almost, I'm speaking like a conspiracy theorist when there's certain facts that just ultimately add up. So I think that the fundamental reason is politics.
Wow.
The reason for the polarization, politics.
For the polarization, it's for political gain. I love that, Bishop. Bishop in the UK. He is the GOAT. He is the greatest of all time. So you just have to honor Bishop Wayne. Geoffrey wanted to contribute something as he's got to run off, and then I'm going to point something towards Justin. I'm going to point something very specific towards yourself right after Geoffrey.
Thank you once again, Elijah, and thank you for this conversation. And so I think first, to answer the question, then I want to share a scripture briefly. I think the issue comes down to this fundamental notion of, Bishop, we talk about economics, this idea of scarcity, this idea that there is not enough to go around, that there is not enough land for two people groups to fully flourish, that there is not the level of resource that is needed to be able to provide the best future for our children and for their children. And so I think when you have a scarcity mindset, which pretty much all of humans do, especially when it comes to the politics of nation states, geopolitical international realities. If China gains power, then the U.S. loses power. This whole notion of scarcity, zero-sum game. If they get more, then I get less, and so I have to do everything I can to preserve my power and keep them from getting power because I don't want to lose mine. Well, I think as Christians, we are called to be prophetic voices that speak into that fundamental human philosophy and idea of scarcity with the prophetic word, the truth of God for where we are actually headed. There's the scripture in Isaiah chapter 19, verses 24 and 25, because we even see it in the church, because how what ways that we have been taught, as it was previously mentioned, that in order to agree with the plan of God, that means we have to come into alignment with all of the actions or the ideologies of the nation state of Israel, because we've drawn this line. They're God's special people. And so, kind of this is where we need to land. And so sometimes there is a favoring of the flourishing of the Jewish people, and for good reason, because it has not been 3 whole generations since the Holocaust, since 6 million Jews were slaughtered. And so there's a reason for the defensiveness that we have toward Israel. And in fact, there should be a posture where we say, hey, if you believe that Israel does not have a right to exist, then maybe you as an entity, not as the people, as an entity do not need to exist. Because as long as Hamas stands, you're not going to have peace in that region, because you're going to continue to have mistrust, because you've got a regional actor who wants to see this nation cease to be. And so Hamas has to go. The Palestinian political power has to be cleansed, has to be revived, because the only reason why Hamas could even gain political power is because the Palestinian people felt like their political powers were not working for them, but they were instead working as agents of Israel. And so you've got to see that. But this scripture, I think, kind of ties together everything that I've tried to say to this point. In that day, Israel will be the third, along with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing on the earth. The Lord Almighty, Yahweh, will bless them, saying, blessed be Egypt, my people, Assyria, my handiwork, and Israel, my inheritance. Isaiah 19, 24 and 25. The plan of God is not just for people from every nation to be discipled, but for every nation to be discipled. So God brought Israel in first so that he could bring all nations in through Israel. So what am I trying to say? Israel is his. Palestine is his. Jordan is his. He wants to call each of these nations his own. And so if the heart of God is for every nation to be his like Israel is, then we got to ask, what does it take for every nation to flourish? And it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. It doesn't have to be this idea where if they flourish, we can't. And so I think as Christians, we've got to think very serious about what does it take for these people groups to flourish, and what are then the configurations of the nation states, the political powers, the economic systems that are necessary for the flourishing of the people. Thank you, sir.
That was absolutely brilliant, Geoffrey. I love that. Thank you so much for your contribution. I know that you've got to go soon, so thank you so much for that. I want to point something towards Justin, because I know Justin is a lawyer. I know that, of course, he runs the AND campaign and empowers believers in civic engagement. Right now, there is a lot of talk about the Marxist framework, okay? A lot of talk about the oppressed versus the oppressor. And in this kind of theme that we're dealing with as it relates to identifying the polarization, one of the things that is emerging is Marxism is on the rise, right? So for example, this comment which says we cannot allow the Marxist framework of oppressor / oppressed to prevail here. The Soviet Union was responsible for so much of this narrative from 1949 on, manipulation of a much more complex situation. The reason why I highlight this and I point it towards Justin is because we know that the whole idea of critical theory or critical race theory is a legal doctrine, and of course this is the narrative that a lot of people, particularly on the right, politically speaking, tend to rise up against, you know, that, and in some ways, not saying Trenee is right or left, and she's actually just an amazing voice, but Trenee kind of highlighted that, you know, Black people cannot constantly, you know, identify themselves as the oppressed in the sense of this Marxist framework. So I want to ask you, do you feel that Marxism is a problem here, which is actually fueling the polarization?
You know, I've always found Marxism to be somewhat reductionist, to be flat, to kind of flatten reality sometimes. But my worry with comments like this is that not that it's against Marxism, but it's used to get someone who might be oppressive off the hook. So it's one thing for us to have some very strong critiques against Marxism. I think it is a problem, and Trenee spoke about that very well, to always break everything into oppressor, oppress. Some things are just more complicated than that. However, what I've seen from the right, what I've seen from a lot of white evangelicals is using Marxism as this boogeyman to let people who may have been oppressive off the hook. Now, just because Marxism might be reductionist and oversimplified doesn't mean that people who have put others in bad situations and who have been oppressed shouldn't be held accountable. And so I want to be very clear that we need to separate those two things. Inasmuch as Israel has done things to the Palestinians, and I'm talking Palestinians again, not Hamas, that have been oppressive. When I look at the unemployment rate in Palestine, when I look at the idea that most of their water is not even drinkable, and I look at some of the limitations that have been placed on the Palestinian people, I can't sit here in good faith and tell you that that's okay. Or I can't sit here in good faith and tell you, well, because a Marxist framework might call that oppression, then I got to call it something else. I mean, if Marxism would point to that as oppression, whether Marxism is all good or bad, that seems to need a definition of oppression to me to some extent. So I just want to separate those two things because I think that's used in a bad way. I'm not a Marxist. I think that's very reductionist. I'm with Trenee in that we can miss a lot of history and a lot of the dynamics when we always try to place the same framework over every situation when it doesn't necessarily fit. I think Trenee hits that on the head. But what I'm not going to do is ignore the fact that there are some tactics that shouldn't be used. People are being mistreated and suffering just because I'm worried about the Marxist framework.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant, Justin, and I would agree that resonates deeply. And I think we also have to, in some way, shape, or form, address the theology of American evangelicalism. And I know it may have been addressed. I glitched, and so my internet was glitching, so I didn't catch everyone's responses. But I do think it's important for us to at least draw the parallels and be attentive to the narratives, because I think so much of this conversation and so much of our beliefs aren't just theological or political, but also battles of language and narrative. I think it's important for us to draw a line and connection to the narrative that for some in, well, I won't say some, I say a lot in white evangelical spaces in America, people have used Israel as a way to garner the blessing in their minds, the blessing and the favor of God. And this is crucial to understand, because I think for some people, when they draw the, we see in the text, in the Old Testament text, we see the ancestral tradition of an ancestral blessing of Abraham. We see the fact that there's a Sinai tradition of blessing. We see the blessing and connection to Israel. We see people who simply throw out the text, which says, if you bless Israel, I'll bless you. And so one of the things we have to acknowledge is some of the things that are contributing to the polarization is the church's incomplete theology, which is not to say that those scriptures are false, but more so to say there is more to the narrative than simply a proof text of scripture out of context, which will simply say, if you just do this one thing, regardless of everything else that happens, focus on this one thing. And so I think we have to acknowledge that many churches have been teaching people consistently to use Israel as a transactional conduit to get the blessing of God, regardless of any nuance, regardless of any historical analysis, regardless of any statement of truth, regardless of any statement of denunciation, regardless of any check and balance. And so believers have been unwittingly sometimes drawn into simply using Israel as this catch-all for, I can just receive the blessings of God if I just adhere to this stance. And I think the church has to be very careful about how we theologize and disciple people, and how we incorporate ethics into our discipleship, and how we train people to consider the fact that just because you say something, and this is a part of the reason why it's difficult for young Black Christians, because what we're seeing is the same people who stood against Black Lives Matter, and I'm speaking generally, the same people who stood against Black Lives Matter are the same people who are saying stand for Israel. And we're saying, wait, your connections, and not the organization Black Lives Matter, of course, which, that's not what I'm talking about, but I'm saying the sentiment, even saying the words, that Black lives in America matter. You're standing with Israel, and you're telling us in the same way we're thinking wrongly about this thing. And you're simply saying, get the blessing of God by standing where we stand. And I think the church has to take a little bit of responsibility for creating a polarized conflict, especially in America, that simply says, believe how we believe just because we threw this one scripture at you, instead of doing deep theological work to say, these are the implications of our position on Israel, our position on Palestine, and our position on this conflict.
Absolutely fantastic, Trenee.
This is super awesome. So while I'm contributing, I'm also taking in. I really sincerely appreciate this conversation. And I just really quickly want to give credence to the statement that I made earlier. And that was that, like, all forms of oppression are not always about us. So a lot of times, like, white evangelicalism and conservatism sort of fall into that category of individuals who are, racist, unaware, ignorant, pro-Israel, a lack of empathy, a lack of compassion, all those different things. But progressivism, which is on the other side, which is why a lot of times I find myself in the middle, that's sort of the umbrella for where Marxist falls into. And, that's the side of individuals who are like, as Black people, you always need access. And in turn, if we're seen as always needing access, then we're never seen as an equal. And so I'm around these conversations all the time. I'm around these people all the time. I'm around these issues all the time. And you sort of see that they're the same type of person, just on two different extremes. And so I say that because I've had discussions with, young Black Christians. I'm almost a Gen Z. I miss Gen Z by 2 years. So they call me like I don't know, it's millennial and Gen Z combined. So I have these discussions with young Gen Z, and what I realize is Gen Z is so powerful because they don't see themselves as oppressed. And I think it's because of those who fought for them, those who paved the road ahead of them, those who've created resources for them, that they believe they can do anything, which is why I think one of their biggest issues is climate change rather than maybe like civil rights or even women's rights or reproductive rights. They're focused on climate change because they've had access to so many different things. The reason why I think this is important is because a lot of what it influences the media, a lot of what's backed by PAC dollars, a lot of what's financially funded are very progressive, not even liberal, very progressive organizations that oftentimes have the attention of young people. And what they oftentimes do is, and this is on the right, far right as well, but I'm specifically talking about those who are very influential in this time. They oftentimes push a very propagandic, I don't even know if that's a word, but a very propagandic, like made up narrative just to drum up emotion from young people because they know it sort of correlates with who they are. I mean, young Gen Z, millennials, specifically Gen Z, they purchase things from businesses when they know that their money is going to an organization that benefits a cause like animal rights and, like I said, climate change. And so I think that's one of the reasons why the church has sort of fallen behind, and like progressive Christianity or even like progressivism in its toll has had such a big influence on Gen Z when it comes to even some of these political or social issues. And so, like Tyler sort of said, I mean, it kind of shows where we need to be as the church to influence, educate, and actually like be educated ourselves, influence, educate, impart in young people so that they actually know the truth of things, and then, sort of make a decision on where they stand. But what I see is, especially with this conservatism and progressivism, I really don't think Black people, I don't think they do the best for Black people to fall in either category. I think in a lot of what the work they do, it works in opposition of our liberation, of our freedom, of our education. You have like progressives that just are kind of against Black men, the Black male head, all those different things. You have conservatives that are also against the Black male head, so that's just an example. And one of the reasons why I say, we oftentimes take our oppression and we sort of build it in the framework of others is, as a politician and in legislative spaces, you're given like an aerial view. God has really had to give me an aerial view to see the world in the way that he wants me to see the world. When you are advocating for so many people and so many issues, and you sort of see the circumstances and situations of all these different issues, and you realize like this level of challenge, of defeat, of oppression, of it is so different than what we're experiencing here in this country. And in turn, if we go to some of those places, we'd realize we actually have more privilege than we think, in these sort of spaces. And those advocating for our privilege, those advocating for our access in these spaces, they do that. I had a colleague say, yeah, because Black women need access, right? And I'm like, Black women are more educated by race and gender. So if you want to create some form of access in some way, advocate for me to get my student loans canceled, So that's just an example of sort of the mentality, versus like international relationships, international humanity, and some of the things that are happening abroad. It's sort of, I guess for me, it's way more of an expansive mindset that we are to have, pray for, and obtain, so that we're able to really do the work of the Lord in whatever space that he has for us, and educate the next generation of young people coming up, so that they have a full aerial view of situations.
Absolutely fantastic contributions that are so intersectional, so laced with a biblical perspective along with a social perspective and a political perspective. Absolutely great contributions. I want to throw this on the table. Justin, you recently did a video where you began to do a level of analysis. As you can tell, I'm a fan. I'm a fan of all of you. I love you guys. I just love you guys. But you did a video recently where you were essentially having a critical analysis of some of the warfare moves, so to speak, of both Hamas and the Israeli government. So my question on the table right now, and I'll probably let Justin start and then everyone else can contribute. Sorry, Bishop Wayne had to leave and Geoffrey had to leave, but I'm sure everyone was blessed by the amazing contributions. How does just war theory play into this conflict? You know, the historic Christian Augustinian theology of just war theory, the Romans 13, you know, that the government, you know, is appointed by God to bear the sword not in vain. Where does this just war theory play into this? And is this being violated in the name of God?
That's an important question, and you know, just war theory is something that we could talk about probably for 3 days straight. I mean, it's a complicated concept. Just so you understand, I mean, basically, just war theory says that in some circumstances, war is justified, self-defense, things of that nature. It's a lot about proportion. So, what are you doing just enough to make sure that you're protecting yourself, making sure people aren't going too far? And I think there is a discussion in this conversation about a just war, right? Does Israel have the right to defend itself? And I would say, based on what Hamas did on October 7th, I think Israel does have a right to defend itself. Unfortunately, and Tyler hit on this a little bit too, some people have taken that to mean that whatever Israel does from that point on, because they're God's people or whatever, is okay. And that's where I've had a problem. I think a lot of folks, especially in white evangelical spaces, have basically said, since Hamas is wrong, whatever retaliation that you might see or whatever response you might see from Israel is acceptable. And if you want your analysis to go any further than Hamas is evil, then you're wrong, anti-Semitic, or whatever. And I think that is unfaithful. I really think it's sinful to try to cut off the analysis at the point of, is Hamas okay? Because you have the conversation of what is a war crime, right? And we see a war crime being a situation where civilians are unnecessarily hurt, that there's a collective response, right? So Israel's in a situation where, yeah, they might respond, but are they doing everything they can do to protect civilians, to make sure that they don't kill civilians? And I think there's a major question that says they probably aren't. You know, they did give people a chance to kind of, you know, over 24 hours to leave Gaza. But when you have 2 million or so people, that's with a lot of them don't even have transportation. That sounds good, and it may play well in certain spaces, but that doesn't really get us to the point where we're saying they're being as surgical as possible to get rid of Hamas rather than kill a lot of civilians that didn't have to be killed. So my biggest point is to say, if I'm going to apply just war theory, I think there's a right to defend yourself, but defending yourself, and some of the comments that we've heard about mowing the grass, wiping these folks out. You have people here who are politicians here in America saying, you know, completely destroy them and all this other stuff. That's where I think if Christians end their analysis just with is Hamas wrong, we're missing out on having any consideration for the lives of Palestinians. And I've seen too many Christian leaders want to cut off the conversation before somebody says, but what about those Palestinians and what happens to them? And so, yeah, we can apply just war theory, but that causes us to look at proportion. It causes us to look at taking every precaution to make sure that people who are civilians aren't hurt.
That's absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for that. And I think, to be honest, you really just unpacked so much that causes us to have questions in questions, but I know we've only got about 8 minutes left. So I want to put this forward, and I'm actually probably gonna target all of you with different questions. I want to say, Trenee, you are a legislator. This is so cool. I've got a lawyer, I've got a legislator, I have a community organizer right here. It's just amazing, right? So, Trenee, what would you say is the role of the church in contrast to the government when dealing with conflicts of this nature, when dealing with war? How would you say, as Black Christians, this is what we handle, and as a legislator, this is what you handle, because you're in the intersection of this, and of course you're more dealing with politics on a domestic level. But as a legislator, what would you say, as standing in between, is supposed to be what Abraham Kuyapa would describe as, different sovereign spheres, that, different places in which God rules and has lordship over. So the church, in contrast to the government, what would you say is the distinction here?
Yeah, really, really great question. I'm going to answer it to the best of my ability. The first thing I really just would encourage everyone to do, and this may sound simple, but pray. Really do pray for your elected leaders. I think politicians are like the easiest to be criticized and oftentimes like ranked the most thankless job. It's a very hard job. It takes a lot of courage to stand on any sort of moral and principle. So really do pray for your elected leaders. The second thing is make an informative vote. Make sure that you are researching who your politician or elected official is. Do not let them in your church if they do not align with your values. Don't let them in front of your pulpit. If they do not align with your values, and make sure to know who your local, state, and federal elected officials are, so that when you have a concern, they need to know. Be present for meetings. Just the really foundational part. All politics are local, so really truly be present for meetings. What I will say is, a lot of times, because of the polarization around political parties, a lot of people don't really believe that Democrats are Christians or believers. Um, and and so I see a lot of elected officials really truly on a quest and a journey for spirituality, whether that's in Buddhism or whether it's in Christianity or Catholicism. And that's because in this sort of work, you really do need a spiritual balance. And so, a lot of politicians are very open to prayer and even sort of building relationships with the church as almost like a space of protection, for the work that it is we do. I think that churches have to really take their rightful places in both political parties. I think that there needs to be people on both sides voting the same way. It was Bishop Jakes who said, like, we don't need any more preachers. We need lawyers, politicians, doctors. And so, begin to encourage young people to get politically involved. Um, but I do think that I think the church, a silent church is a violent nation. I think the church has been silent for far too long, and especially the Black church when it comes to issues that we feel like don't really pertain to us. I wish to see more uh, Black leaders rise up, for protection of life, providing resources for pregnant women, showing up at Board of Education meetings. Because to be honest with you, the only time I see certain leaders come to the Capitol is when they're lobbying for charter schools. And that's no shade. They're fighting for a better academic school structure for students. But in turn, my colleagues only see collars when it's to ask for funds for schools, when they should see collars when it's to put pressure on policy that's destroying families, or even when it's to ask a politician if they want prayer. And so we have to take back territory and not be afraid and ashamed to be in the state capitol and places where our taxpayer dollars are funding. And let me tell you something, Connecticut taxpayer dollars feed me very well. So I tell people all the time, my lunch was good today. Come to the Capitol and come talk to us. And so I think it's important that we really do take our rightful places in politics. The idea of, no talking about politics or religion, that's out the window, especially in this day and age when policy is what we have to live and abide by. And there's a lot of legislative things that are rising up that's targeting churches, that's targeting places of worship, not only Christians, but other religions as well, and children. There's a lot of policy that's being created right now that's targeting your kids. And so I push back on it as much as I possibly can, but we need believers who are unapologetic and unashamed and unafraid to really stand on morals, because that's what we need in government.
Absolutely fantastic. I will not even add or take away from what you just said. Thank you so much. We only have about 2 minutes left of this conversation. Man, we have covered, there's so much to talk about. Honestly, we would have to be here for like 50 days, just covering so much. But, every single one of these amazing voices, from Bishop Wayne Malcolm to Geoffrey Golden to Justin Gibboney to Trenee McGee to Tyler Burns, are doing the work. This is what their life is invested in dealing with the intersection of faith and culture. And so I would want everybody who is both here on the live and also those who will watch the replay, plug into what they're doing, connect to what they're doing, because they're equipping people, they're resourcing people, and particularly Black Christians, particularly Christians at large, but especially Black Christians, to be able to engage in these conversations. To conclude, I would like everyone here to just give a final comment to two groups of people, Christian leaders and Christians in general, on approaching this complete conflict. What would be the real sentiments of your heart if you had an opportunity to sit in front of every Christian leader in the world and every Christian in general in the world? What would you say to those two groups of people right now, in light of the weight of what is happening in this moment right now? So I'll start with Justin, then Tyler, and then we'll end with Trenee, and then I will conclude with prayer. Justin.
I would tell leaders to be impartial, to apply your compassion and also your discernment to both sides equally, so you can really see what's going on, to love and care and be concerned about the suffering of everyone. And that's not to say to treat everything equal, to treat both sides equal. That's not to say that we should create a false equivalence, but it is to say that we are not to be, nothing in the Bible forces us to be partial in this issue. So I'd say to be impartial and show compassion in that way.
And to believers in general? So to leaders and believers in general?
To believers in general, care. I mean, see how you can help out, how you can push your senators and Congress people or whatever to make sure that they're getting what the Palestinians need, what Israelis who are being hurt need. That's something that you can do. They hear you when you send letters and make calls.
Thank you, Tyler.
Yeah, I would say that if I were speaking to Christian leaders, I would say the most powerful and informed voices that we will hear that should shape our dialogue, our conversation, and our perspective are the ones who are on the ground and who are most affected. And I think it's going to become important for leaders to not simply educate ourselves in spaces that talk about the issue, but from people who are experiencing the tragedy and the violence and the oppression and the terrorism themselves. So I would say to Christian leaders, equip yourselves to listen to the people who are on the ground. I would say to Christians in general, we must embrace, model, and learn that in God's kingdom, people are not pawns, that people are not chess pieces that are moved across the board in order to get to a kingdom end. We serve a God who is loving, powerful, gracious, and good enough to love people authentically who have been created in his image and to also desire their full flourishing. And that's regardless of one's country, that's regardless of one's ethnicity. And I think it is crucial for believers in Jesus to embrace that Palestinian people are created in the image and likeness of God. I think it's crucial to understand and embrace that Israeli people are created in the image and likeness of God. And for that to guide our understanding, not power, not politics, not theological chess, not end times obsession, but for us to embrace the fact that God truly does love the people who he has created to inhabit the earth and welcomes them into his kingdom. And so I would say let's emphasize that beloved community and realize that people are not pawns in God's kingdom.
Thank you so much, Trenee.
Short and sweet, I would say, actually, this quote is from Justin. He said, if you are too busy sort of pointing the finger and calling someone else evil, you kind of, you then don't see the evil within yourself. And even within evil, it's like something about what they're trying to do is good. And obviously that's has much context to it. But I say that because I think a lot of times we as people, as spiritual leaders in the church, it becomes, well, you're right on this and I'm wrong. And this is my theological difference. And this is where I stand on it. And that's just, but I think that's caused a lot of problems and pain and hurt within the church community and especially amongst young people. And so I think we have to do a due diligence of really connecting with people, listening to them, effectively listening, effectively communicating, and then allowing God to lead us and serve us in the capacities where we're called. My friend who went to Israel, she was called to hang out with Palestinian security guards and Palestinian believers and Israeli Muslims. That was what she was called to do. She was called to do that work. And so God is calling us to all different spheres, and that's to really make impact the way he truly wants us to. And then secondly, there are a lot of great organizations. I believe the Global Giving is a good organization that is, it's just humanitarian and crisis. They take donations. They're taking donations for both Israeli and Palestinian people. You can even specify if you would like your donations to go to children. There's so many fatherless and motherless children now, and there's so many mothers and fathers who've lost their children. And as someone who's a big proponent of education and young people, please see what you can financially do. There are even organizations where if you can't financially contribute, you may be able to send things and they sort of screen everything to those in need. And so let's just really continue to pray for the people of Israel and Palestine. And we used to say when we were younger, peace in the Middle East, and really say that now with context and full understanding that, that these nations come together.
Wow. Well, I just want to thank, firstly, all of you, Justin, Pastor Tyler, Trenee, Bishop Wayne, Geoffrey, who sacrificed your time to just be able to have this conversation. I know that this is a burden that is not just affecting the world, but is something that is deeply on your hearts as well as you look upon our brothers and sisters in the faith, particularly Black Christians who are right now in the middle of many polarized conversations. I know that there's many different angles we could have continued to go, but I believe that this conversation really echoes the heart of God. It comes to the real centerpiece of what the heart of the Father is, which is to, to do good, to love justice, to rid the world of evil. And the Son of Man was revealed, 1 John 3 verse 8, to destroy the works of the enemy. And we are supposed to be co-laborers with Christ, as 1 Corinthians chapter 3 highlights, co-laborers with him to rid the world of this evil. And so we have power invested in us, we have grace invested in us, as not just as Black Christians, but as Christians in general, to be able to contribute towards the challenges that are emerging right now. So I want to thank you for this conversation. I want to thank you for the work that all of you do. Again, Bishop Wayne and Geoffrey in absence. And I'm excited about the future, because the Bible says that as darkness covers the earth and gross darkness the people, that the glory of the Lord shall rise upon us. And it doesn't say fall upon us, rise upon us, which means everything that God has put within us, our ideas, the organizations, the structures and the strategies, are going to be highlighted by the Spirit of God in times of crisis. And so I'm excited, because right now our juices are flowing, right? Our resources are stirring up to be able to bring change and make a positive difference in our world. And so thank you so much. I believe that this conversation is going to be left on YouTube, on Facebook, as a resource. Everyone's going to be able to come back to it, hear some thoughts, and it will trigger healthy conversations in this polarized climate right now. So I'm just going to conclude in prayer. Our Lord and our God, we thank you. You are Jesus. You are the Father of lights. And I glorify you right now, because in the midst of darkness, your light shines and the world can't comprehend it. But we thank you that we have fellowship with it. And so we say, Jesus, let your light shine in the midst of this darkness, prevail in the midst of injustice, and let your glory be seen as we do your work, as your hands and feet, as your body, the expression of your spirit in the earth. We bless you and we thank you for this moment. Heal our divisions, and let your glory be seen. In Jesus' name, amen and amen. Thank you all so much for being on this, and thank you all who watched this live and those who watched the replay. And we'll be back again soon. We'll see what God does. All right, God bless you.